All right, I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order, the Station Resource Committee meeting. Our first item is a summary of the proposed Rule 1480. Susan Nakamura, go right ahead.
Okay. I think they're pulling up the slides. So by way of background, proposed Rule 1480, it's a new rule. It's ambient monitoring and sampling for metal toxic air contaminants. Back in when we were doing the rulemaking process for Rule 1469 for the chrome plating and anodizing, the issue of ambient monitoring came up. Community representatives wanted to incorporate that into Rule 1469. Staff had decided that we wanted to focus on putting on the air pollution controls. Metal Finishing Association had also commented that they felt that a more universal rule instead of focusing on just the chrome plating and anodizing facilities would be more appropriate. Staff agreed, and so we have today presenting to you proposed Rule 1480. We're working through a public process. We've had 9 working group meetings. We have a working group meeting, the 10th one, scheduled for next week. So, staff believes there's a strong need for proposed Rule 1480. This is a lot about cost recovery and handing over the responsibility to certain facilities that we find that their air toxic emissions from the metal toxic air contaminants has an extremely high health risk. When we identify a facility that their health risk is over the significant threshold, which is for cancer over 100 million, that's when we can designate the facility. In the past, we've had, this just shows 3 facilities where they have approved health risk assessments, where we have been conducting air toxics monitoring. The monitoring efforts have been going into, for some of these, 3+ years. Some of them are even longer. One facility there is even longer than that. But what we find is that these facilities, their health risk could be 10, 15, nearly 20 times higher than the significant risk threshold. And so the reason why the South Coast AQMD continues to do the air toxics monitoring is until those permanent pollution controls can be put on, we want to have that additional information and surveillance over the facility to ensure that the surrounding community is protected until the permanent controls are installed. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on Rule 1402. Rule 1402 is an existing rule that we have that applies to existing facilities and establishes health risk thresholds for the facility. Under Rule 1402, there is a provision for potentially high risk level facilities. And these facilities have been found to have a health risk over 100 million. And through this process, they're required within 90 days of designating to provide what we refer to as an early action risk reduction plan. And then there's a consolidated effort to expedite the implementation by requiring them to submit their air toxics inventory report, health risk assessment, risk reduction plan simultaneously, and then they have a shorter time period to reduce their overall risk. Since this provision was included in Rule 1402 in 2016, we have had 3 facilities that have been designated as potentially high-risk level facilities, 2 of them in Paramount, 1 of them in Long Beach. So proposed Rule 1480 and complements Rule 1402. The emission reduction part of will come from Rule 1402 as it quantifies the health risk and then requires the risk reduction measures. Rule 1480 will require the monitoring and sampling, and that would continue until the risk reduction plan is implemented. So the applicability of proposed Rule 1480 would apply potentially to facilities that are conducting metal operations, and we have these listed here, and those that have metal toxic air contaminants where the Office of Environmental Human Health Hazard Analysis has identified health values. The metal tax probably that we would likely see is hexavalent chrome, and then also possibly arsenic, cadmium, and nickel. So a facility would not need to monitor until we, the South Coast AQMD, has been conducting monitoring, and then we can make the demonstration and meet the criteria that's specified in the rule. So there's a variety of pathways that are established in proposed rule that are established today of why we might start doing facility-specific monitoring. So we're into starting our 5th MATE study, and in our 3rd MATE study, we did identify a cement manufacturing facility through the MATE study and did facility monitoring around, there were 2 facilities and pinpointed it to 1 facility. Community monitoring under 617, there could be other community monitoring outside of 617 that also, where we do facility-specific monitoring. If we have non-compliance or complaints, we can also initiate monitoring. That's probably more of the case that occurred in the city of Paramount. So this is just a topical overview of proposed rule 1480. We first would start our ambient monitoring and sampling. If we had elevated levels, we'd then conduct an investigation, look at that particular facility to identify sources within their facility that could be generating certain metal toxic air contaminants. If the investigation shows that the facility is a source of these emissions, then the facility meets the criteria, then the facility would need to conduct ambient monitoring and sampling. If we can't designate the facility, we may continue to do the monitoring and sampling. This just walks through the designation process that's established in proposed rule 1480. Facility would get an initial notice. This is an early warning to the facility that we are conducting ambient monitoring near their facility. This is a request from the stakeholders to provide this early notice. They want to know right off the bat that we're even the possibility that we might consider determining that this facility could be needing to do monitoring, so they can start to gather information. We may then at that point ask for them to either conduct some emissions testing, or we may conduct emissions testing, ask for permission to, or the facility would be required to allow us to do fence line monitoring. And then the facility would be issued a notice of findings. If we have enough information to say that the facility is a source of these metal TAC emissions, we believe that they're impacting a sensitive receptor that's over 100 million, we would issue the notice of findings. The facility has the opportunity to provide us with additional information to sort of rebut the notice of findings, and then we would make the determination from there. So this just lays out the main criteria to designate a facility to conduct the monitoring. 3 main criteria is the facility has equipment or processes with metal TAC emissions. Those emissions are capable of being released into the ambient air. And then we would do air dispersion modeling on the facility's emissions to see whether or not the impact at a sensitive receptor was greater than 100 million. This provides an overview facility, the designation process, which I already went over. If a facility is designated and they meet the criteria, they would need to begin conducting the monitoring and sampling. They would monitor once every 3 days. Right now, the current proposal is that they would have a minimum of 2 monitors. They have the opportunity to submit a plan that would reduce the frequency and/or the number of monitors once their health risk is less than 25 in a million at the sensitive receptor. And then they could submit a monitoring relief plan, essentially completely out of the obligation to monitor once they've completed the implementation of the risk reduction plan under Rule 1402. So 2 key issues I'd like to highlight today. One is the stakeholders have commented that there's not sufficient amount of time to gather information and to respond to notice of findings. We believe that there is a sufficient amount of time. The process for us to designate, we're looking at is probably a minimum of 6 months. We give them the early notification upfront to allow them to start getting their information together to provide to us. The second issue I wanted to highlight is in regards to the cost. Stakeholders have commented that the cost to conduct the monitoring and sampling, particularly for small businesses, could be a significant impact. Staff has been working to look at different ways that we can reduce the cost. So the cost for the monitoring and sampling if you had 2 hexavalent chrome monitors, you had 2 staff people that were going out there sampling at a frequency of 1 to 3 days, is $164,000 a year. And the reason why we had the 2 staff people that were identified was that this is, if they opt to have us do the monitoring, this is how much they would pay. Is that when we sign a monitor on a light pole and we have to have somebody hold a ladder, it's a safety issue for us. But if the facility can provide access to their within their fence line on a safe location that's on not on a light pole where someone has to hold a ladder, almost more of a step stool type of approach, then the cost can be reduced to $114,000. We are our next version of the rule. We're actually looking at a minimum of 1 monitor instead of a minimum of 2 monitors. So the annual cost is going to come down to $80,000. So really been working hard internally to figure out like what we feel comfortable, since their focus is on our focus will be on that downwind monitor. We would probably give facilities that option to not have that upwind monitor, and so the cost can be reduced from 164 down to 80,000. Once they get to the reduced monitoring and sampling plan, if we can get to 1 staff person and 1 hexavalent chrome monitor, then it'd be $40,000 a year. So working hard to reduce that cost to move this rule forward. This rule is scheduled for a set hearing November 1st with a public hearing in December. Questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Mayor Mitchell, please go ahead.
Is that cost, Susan, is that an annual cost? I think you said per year.
Yes, it's an annual cost. We haven't
And that
presented, we haven't presented in the rule. We have quarterly costs, but those are annual costs.
Okay, because there are ongoing costs, right? Because do these samples have to be sent to our laboratory for analysis, or how do they analyze the samples from the air monitoring? So
the facility has 2 options. They can either hire a third-party contractor to conduct the monitoring and sampling, or they can pay us, and the cost is a full, Jillian calls it the full buffet cost. So it's the cost for us to go out there, pick up the sample, and actually do the analysis of the sample.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any other board member questions?
Mr. Chair, one more. I'm just thinking, are the potential facilities that would be subject to this rule, are they the 3 that have been out of compliance, or are there more?
So right now, there is the possibility we could designate on existing facilities, but for we've kind of looked, historically at facilities that have been conducting monitoring. So it's possible, because there is ongoing monitoring for some of those facilities that might be, depending on how much longer that they would do the monitoring, that might make sense for us to designate, but we haven't decided that yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Mr. Can I ask something?
Sure, Supervisor.
So, am I correct that once a facility has been designated as potentially high risk, then they have to submit the health risk assessment and risk reduction, and that might take 3 years?
So under Rule 1402, that whole process, from the point you designate them to the point they prepare their health risk assessment, they prepare their risk reduction plan, we approve it, and they fully implement it, can be as long as 3 years.
And then they would be required to start the ambient monitoring?
No. They would start they would start the ambient monitoring possibly maybe 6 months after we designate them.
Oh.
Yeah, and then they would finish the ambient monitoring after they finish the risk reduction plan at the end of the 3 years.
Okay. And they do ambient monitoring until something happens?
Yeah, they would conduct the ambient monitoring until they complete the implementation of their risk reduction plan, which would represent the completion of installation of their permanent pollution controls.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Very good. I'm assuming we have some public comment on this?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have two public comments. First is Mr. Jerry Desmond.
Please go ahead.
Thank you.
We have a podium now.
Thank you.
Change it up a
Wow. Wow. Jerry Desmond on behalf of the Metal Finishing Association of Southern California. A couple of thoughts and perspectives for an industry, the plating shops, as we go into this rule. First, as Susan has mentioned, we've been participating in, I think, 9 public working group meetings. A 10th is scheduled for next week, and we're looking forward to an updated draft of the regulation itself to look at as the effort continues to address the primary issues. One of the key issues, issue number 2, I think that Susan identified in the presentation, is the costs. To provide a perspective, our facilities now, MFASC came together on Rule 1469 in terms of implementation of that rule. So we're endeavoring in that environment, incurring significant costs and addressing emissions in that rule. This rule is 1480 is monitoring and sampling to develop data. In addition, this rule brings in Rule 1402 for our facilities, and as we look at the costs that are now being reduced, hopefully to $40,000 a year or so, it's in addition to the cost of 1402 if we're brought into to those rules. A second issue is the on-ramp and off-ramp and the timeframes. As we look at the timeframes of responding to the data and the notice of findings, it's 30 days or perhaps 60 days. For a number of facilities, that can be quite a burden because we have the obligation to be placed on us to disprove that there are other contributing factors of emissions that contribute to a significant risk level. And developing that data within 60 days, we think could be quite difficult, but we're working on that. Another is to, and I think the rules being developed in this fashion, to talk about the emissions, the contribution of the specific facility to a significant risk level. It could be once there's a finding of a significant risk level at a sensitive receptor, we want to make sure that a facility that's going to be triggered to do the monitoring and sampling, that the emissions actually do exceed that significant risk level, and it's not just any kind of contribution. And I think there's efforts being made to address that issue as well. And then also to note that these costs and these efforts are in addition to the 1469 for hexavalent chromium facilities. And so as we endeavor, is there a way to acknowledge that if they're already addressing emissions in a fashion that's protecting the environment as intended by the rule, is there a way to avoid an extensive cost with monitoring and sampling? And I think that's being looked at as well. So at this point, as we continue to work with the district, we're not at a point to say that we embrace the rule yet. We have significant concerns, but we're working hard to try to resolve them.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, the next
speaker.
Yes, Mr. Wesley Turnbow.
Yeah, board members, good morning. My name is Wesley Turnbow. I'm representing the Metal Finishers of California, as well as my own company, which is a family-owned company in Compton named EME. Most of you are aware of 1469. I think the costs at the end were by the staff, and the report was figured to be 3 to 4% of revenues for companies. So those of us in the 1469 rules, certainly my company involved, has about $200,000 in costs already sunk into figuring out how to enclose buildings, how to then change ventilation, how to take care, and we put on several scrubbers on our tanks that have now come into compliance with that. And so it's costly. I just want to emphasize a few of these things that were spoken by my colleague, Mr. Desmond, and the cost is a big one. I think at the last week, the public spoke. Those in the community, or one of the community members spoke and said their concern, and certainly our concern, and really the only thing they represented is if we spend costs to monitoring, aren't those going to be costs that we could have spent in handling and scrubbing and figuring out how to comply? And so there's that worry. Monitoring doesn't clean the air. And so if we're already in a 1402 situation, we're already spending money hard to figure out how to not be a risk factor. do we want to burn those resources? It's a fight for resources, and they're certainly limited in these kind of companies. We want to burn those resources in monitoring, which is very costly. Kind of finally, I'm worried about the off-ramp as well. As many of you know, I speak in the hexavalent chrome world because that's my world, but there are obviously many other toxins we're dealing with. But in that world, the numbers are so low that we're using. We worry about the off-ramp being below background and it being almost impossible to get to a place where you're not monitoring anymore, or your 1402 compliance and work has actually done the job to somehow bring down maybe the whole community's toxins to a place where you're now not in the limelight. So thanks for your time. We're certainly working with staff diligently, and we'll just continue to go down the road. They're aware of these issues, and we're working through them.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, there are no more speakers for this agenda item.
All right. Any other questions, my colleagues?
Just one, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
We're dealing with like 3 sets of rules here, 1402, 1469, and 1480. Just for staff, it seems to me in thinking about how those work together, that if you put on the controls that may be required under 1469, your emissions would be reduced, so you wouldn't get to 1480 where you need to monitor. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how those rules overlap and how they would work together? Because obviously our stakeholders here are concerned about the costs, and so I think we should be looking at that and addressing that also.
So a lot of the amendments that we did for 1469 were because of the monitoring we had done at Hickson and Anaplex, and there was a third facility, Lubco, and the source issues with the building enclosure, but then the larger issue was this heated sodium dichromate tank. So 1469, when that is fully implemented, we should not see the issues that we were seeing from these types of facilities. So instead of us designating every facility as like, we want this, universal, a rule that's going to address all the facilities all at once, that have the same type of tank, the same type of issues, the things that we were finding when we visited these facilities, cross draft that was going across, even tanks that are controlled. It's like that we're carrying out hexavalent chrome emissions and those types of issues. So hopefully, it's like after we implement 1469, we should not see these issues if a facility is complying with the rule. There's another rule that's coming, 1469.1 on the spray booths. That was another issue that we had seen out with some of these facilities, and that rule is going to be coming in 2020.
So Mayor, this is Philip Fine, if I can add. One of the other reasons that we think this rule is important, and tying it to 1402, is traditionally our health risk assessments under 1402 and risk reduction plans under 1402 were purely based on estimations of emissions and modeling. And the estimates of emissions were largely based on what comes out of an individual stack. But what we found in Paramount and are finding in other places, it's not only those emissions that are important. So what we're trying to do is bring some kind of monitoring into that process, the 1402 process. So we're tying it to 1402, we're tying it to significant risk facilities, and we're adding kind of a new part of that process in 1480 that allows some monitoring to occur by the facility in this period between when we discover a problem and when they solve the problem, just to ensure that things are getting better and there's no, single days or months where we have a major problem that we need to address on a shorter time frame. That will allow staff to take their monitoring resources to look at other communities and other types of facilities if the facilities can do a bit of monitoring in that interim period. So it's addressing a gap we've discovered in our kind of our HRA risk reduction process. So that's one way to think of why we're going forward with 1480.
Okay, thank you. I encourage you to keep working with the stakeholders on some of the issues they've raised today. I think there's a way to get to yes for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other board member comments? If not, we'll go ahead and move on to our the reclaim quarterly report, update number 6. Susan again.
Yep. So, quarterly update, we have now a second working group, where it's a new source review working group. So it applies to the reclaim transition, but also it's broader because there's other new source review issues that will affect other plumes other than NOx. So, we had the first new source review working group meeting, in September. We are continuing on our rule development on the landing rules. We had one public workshop, which was for 1110.2. In July, the board adopted amendments to Rule 2001 to no longer allow a facility to opt out of reclaim, and that was based on input from EPA that they wanted the 3 regulatory elements, the reclaim rules, the landing rules, and new source review to be SIP approved before we start exiting facilities. We did have a face-to-face meeting with EPA in August, and we've had 5 conference calls with them over the past quarter. So showed this slide at the last quarterly update, but slight little revisions in terms of some of the dates on some of these rules and regulations, but the ultimate date in terms of when we would submit everything to EPA is still the timeframe of late 2021, early 2022. So we had 2 working group meetings over the past quarter. We didn't have one in August because we did go up to EPA in mid-August, which I'll highlight. The meeting in June was to tee up this discussion that we've been having with EPA in regards to changes on the applicability for new source review for what's referred to as major polluting facilities, those facilities over 10 tons per year. And applicability and offsetting requirements when they're doing a modification. We highlighted the discussions that we had with EPA at the September meeting, and I'll discuss some of that in the upcoming slides. So this is just highlighting some of the key topics that we've discussed with EPA, and I'll walk through those. So the first issue in regards to the Federal Clean Air Act demonstration is that the board adopted amendments to reclaim in 2015 that required a 12 ton per day, we refer to it as a 12 ton per day shave on the allocations, which leaves 14.5 tons per day of remaining emissions or allocations in the reclaim program. EPA is saying that before we exit the facilities, we need to do a one-time demonstration to show that the actual emissions from the reclaim facilities are below the 14.5 tons per day. So we're demonstrating that SIP obligation. So EPA also recognizes that we're working on these landing rules and that some of these will have future effective dates, and they're okay with staff using some of these future compliance dates if needed to demonstrate the 14.5, the 12 ton per day shade, that we've met that. So we did discuss with the working group these 2 issues that are relating to the applicability of new source review for major facilities that are doing a major modification, and also if those facilities trigger the applicability, the amount of offsets that they would need to provide. And the proposed change could result in more facilities, more of the major polluting facilities, when they have a modification at their facility, that they would have to install best available control technologies. And those facilities would also need to provide more offsets. These changes don't affect any of the facilities that are less than 10 tons and any new equipment at a facility. So the stakeholder comments that just wanted to kind of walk through that is that they feel that this federal one-time demonstration is not needed, that reclaim is a BARC program. Going into command and control is a BARC, so BARC to BARC, there's no need for a demonstration. On the second issue, they feel that post-reclaim that their preference is not to have Regulation 13, but that we continue with Rule 2005, which is the reclaim new source review requirements. The third issue is that they feel that if we just don't touch Reg 13, that EPA would not issue a SIP call, and that we wouldn't need to make these changes for the major polluting facilities, and so therefore don't touch Reg 13, and then kind of goes back to that second issue, just maintain Rule 2005. And then the fourth issue is if we were to have post-reclaim, we have Regulation 13, and if there were these changes on the applicability and the offsetting requirements, they want us to explore other options with EPA than the recommendations that we had presented to them that would be less impactful. One more comment here is that, so the stakeholders did schedule a meeting with EPA, and that meeting is scheduled for next week. EPA did invite the South Coast AQMD to listen in on that conversation, so we're going to be listening to hear what types of comments that EPA's response to the stakeholder comments are on these. So wanted to just give you last update is that we're working on a second version of the Reclaim Transition Plan. Since the first version, we've adopted and amended a number of rules. Wanted to discuss the new process for exiting facilities that EPA is recommending, that we have the 3 regulatory elements completed and SIP approved before we start exiting facilities, and then highlight the discussions of the new source review issue. So we're working on that second version. Rulemaking status, still working hard on all these landing rules. 1110.2 is scheduled to come to the board in November. 1109.1, we're getting very close to having proposed BARC limits that we can discuss with the stakeholders. 218.1 is the most technical rule. This is the monitoring, reporting, and record keeping for SIMS. Staff is working through a variety of different issues with the stakeholders, and that's going to come in the first quarter of 2020. 1117 is a glass melting rule. There's 2 facilities that are affected, but they have pretty substantial NOx emissions, and so we're working through with those facilities on this proposed rule. The next 3 rules on 1147. 1147.1 is for metal melt, is for the larger facilities under, or larger pieces of equipment under 1147. And 1147.2 is for metal melting facilities. It's actually very promising in what we're finding on information on these, on the equipment regulated under 1147. A lot of good data, source test data that's showing that we may be able to actually push down the limits on for some of these sources. So we feel hopeful there. And then 1147.3 is for aggregate facilities, and we're still in the data gathering phase of that. Ongoing efforts is continue the Reclaim Working Group, and then we're piggybacking the Reclaim Working Group with the Reg 13 New Source Review Working Group, many of the same stakeholders. Continue on the rulemaking activities, and then continue to work with EPA and CARB on these NSR issues, and then you'll be seeing probably in the next, I don't know, hopefully not more than 3 months, a revision to the Reclaim Transition Plan. So that concludes the quarterly update.
I'm sorry, Susan, you sort of broke up on my side. When will we see that update to the revision plan?
I think 3 to 6 months. It's like if,
okay.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Very good. Board member questions? I'm not seeing any. Any public comments on this item?
No public comments in CCA.
All right, very good. We'll be interested to see how that goes, and especially the comments back and forth with the EPA and the stakeholders, so good luck. All right, with that, we have our 2 written reports attached. Anyone have any questions on those reports? No. Anyone have any other business? Do you have any general public comment?
None here.
All right.
We have one comment.
None at any other remote locations or at the CC8?
Yes.
Comment there.
Mr. Chair, we have one
Oh,
comment.
CC8, public comment?
Yes. Mr. Ivan Fetter.
Good morning, Chairman Benoit and committee members. My name is Ivan Tether, thank you, and I'm here this morning for Beta Offshore. Beta Offshore operates 3 oil platforms 9 miles from shore and uses 7 platform cranes to transfer supplies and people to and from docked vessels. Over the past 2 years, Beta Offshore spent well over $1.5 million to replace all 7 Tier 2 crane engines with advanced Tier 4 final engines. These are 190 horsepower engines, and they achieve state-of-the-art emissions reduction by both a diesel oxygen catalyst and selective catalytic reduction. Crane engines typically run for only 20 to 60 seconds as a load is raised. And when the load is lowered, the engine is idle, allowing gravity to take over. The Tier 4 engines are CARB certified. Their permits require backed compliance. NOx emissions are extremely minimal, reduced, I think, over 97% compared to the old Tier 2 engines. We and Beta Offshore greatly appreciate your staff's substantial efforts to address our concerns about proposed amended Rule 1110.2. The source testing protocol requiring extended engine operation under an artificial load requires abnormal crane operation. This abnormal operation can damage the crane, causing failure, which could injure platform personnel. Rule 1110.2 has many exemptions, including one for these same Tier 4 engines used in agriculture. Ventura County APCD's Rule 74.9 exempts engines used to power cranes. We request a very simple exemption confined to OCS cranes powered by Tier 4 engines. Proper operation will be ensured with permit conditions. While proposed amended Rule 1110.2 is not on your agenda this morning, although it was just referenced in the reclaim report, we wanted to share this information with you, relate our appreciation again for the efforts of district staff to address our concerns for safety of employees and equipment, and encourage the district to consider adding the language we've suggested to the final rule coming before the governing board on November 1. Thank you again for your time and consideration.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that forward. And unfortunately, since it's not on the agenda, we can't have much comment on it. But we do appreciate you bringing that up, and we'll hopefully we'll see what staff can do between now and November.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair Benoit, if we could ask staff for a report back on that and an assessment of the proposed language, it seems to me that an exemption for this sort of thing is reasonable.
Very reasonable. Staff, could we go ahead and do that?
This rule is scheduled for November, so there's no stationary source committee between this and the board meeting.
But you can put in the presentation.
Oh, yeah, definitely, you can
I mean,
have a presentation.
At
What
the
was
board
that?
meeting, can we hear a response to this?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. Any other public comment there in CC8?
No, sir.
All right. I'm not seeing any in the other locations. None here.
I'm here.
And with that, we'll go ahead and move to adjournment. Our next meeting will be on November 15th at 10:30. Thank you very much.